This work is really, I think, arguably the earliest piece of research coming out of a fairly large project that Doug Houston and I are co-principal investigators on, doing a before and after evaluation of the Expo line. And as background, I have been, from about 2007, 2008, I have been trying to build an argument within transportation that we do experiments in our field all the time. Every time we build something, we're doing an experiment. We ought to evaluate it as an experiment, trying to find a control group and trying to detect treatment effects. Something that's not radical. I've actually written articles where I've said that we're about 50 years behind other fields in social sciences. So as you might imagine, saying things like that wasn't getting me very far. And so with the Expo line about to open up, I discussed with Doug and with some of our PhD students at Irvine the idea that we should really do, as careful as possible, a job of doing an experimental control group before and after evaluation. Steve Spears is a PhD student at Irvine, now in his 5th year, and he has really become, in many ways, the project manager for this effort, and what you're going to see is part of his dissertation. Steve did an engineering degree at Clemson University, worked as an engineer for many years, did a master's in planning at Virginia Commonwealth University with some study in Europe, and then came to the PhD program at UC Irvine in fall of 2008. At that time, he was keenly interested in what I tend to call psychological and attitudinal factors involved in travel behavior. And this is something that has become a popular research topic in Europe and somewhat less popular but growing in the United States. And part of it, while there's been hints around the edges, and one of our students here, Jongwoo Lee, is doing some very nice work on the very same topic, we've been rather dominated in the US by this idea of what you would call kind of a neoclassical economics. People have utility functions, they go out and travel, end of story. Steve was relentless in discussing with me the idea that there must be more. And so under Steve's leadership, we built into the Expo line study a battery of questions to measure attitudes towards travel. And what you will see today is results from the first cross-section of that, what we call the before opening data, which were collected about a year ago. And not to give away the story too much, but I guess to foreshadow a bit, you will see that Steve was very wise and that my suspicions were unfounded, which happens more often than professors care to admit. And sometimes more often than students believe. So believe in yourself, all you students out there. Without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Steve Spears.
All right. Thanks, Marlon. It's a great turnout today, amazing turnout. So I don't know if it's the food or the paper, but I'm going to do my part and we'll let your food digest for a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about how we came to this problem, which is really something that Marlon has been pushing in a research group we had at UC Irvine for, I don't know, it's been a couple years ago now that we started doing this. And it really came out of the SB 375 regulations that have sort of changed the context of regional planning in California. If you're not familiar with SB 375, it sets limits on ground transportation greenhouse gas emissions and tries to seek out reductions. The goals are 8% reduction by 2020 compared to 2005. And a 13% reduction by 2035. So the metropolitan planning organizations are responsible for putting together a sustainable community strategy to meet these targets. And so in our region, it's Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, that's responsible for that. So for SCAG, they list 4 key elements to their sustainable community strategy: land use planning, transportation network investments, which includes multimodal investments, transportation demand management, carpooling, telecommuting, parking pricing, those sorts of things, and transportation network management, essentially efficiency efforts, signal timing, on-ramp metering. So nothing too out of the ordinary, what we've been discussing for many years in the travel behavior field. But what Marlon has been pushing with us for quite a long time now is that the top-down approach from the MPOs, especially since the MPOs cannot regulate, they don't have control over land use policy at the local level, that there should be at least a complementary, if not a alternative, bottom-up approach to dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. So that approach would be that we allow localities to innovate and do whatever they feel is necessary in their context, in the local context, in order to meet the targets. And then, of course, that gets scaled up to the region. So as examples, neighborhood electric vehicles, if a locality wants to do something like that, they should be allowed to do that as part of the greenhouse gas reduction. Bicycle sharing, innovative parking pricing, pedestrianization, or anything that they can come up with. There are obviously schemes that we haven't even thought of yet that localities may come up with if they're allowed to innovate on this. But the catch is that in order to meet the targets, or in order to say you're meeting the targets, there has to be a way to evaluate these. And so that's what we've been talking about the last couple of years at UCI. So our objectives have been to come up with a travel survey method that can capture neighborhood level effects, these local changes in whatever programs that they are. We want them to be deployed quickly. So if there's a change that comes out and a locality decides to pursue a program, unlike regional travel studies that are done every 10 years, we could get in the field, evaluate it within a very short amount of time. In the case of the Expo line study, we're essentially talking about a year or less than a year. And it has to be cost effective. So we tried to come up with something that could be deployed quickly and didn't cost a whole lot of money to do it. And part of the way you do that is use students, right, Marlon? But even in the larger scale as a tool, this is a cost-effective tool. So the neighborhood travel and activity study, which has been part of the Expo line study, is really our test bed for these new travel survey methods. And what we're trying to do is evaluate travel behavior change, greenhouse gas emissions, of course, for measuring vehicle miles traveled, and also physical activity. So just an Expo line study overview. I think you're all familiar probably if you are here at USC with the Expo line. Just opened up in late April of 2012. So what we've done is the first quasi-experimental before-after study of a major rail transportation project in California. And so this allows us to evaluate the Expo line in terms of vehicle use and emissions through having information on vehicles and miles traveled, through transit use, physical activity, and attitudes and perceptions, which is my smaller part of this whole thing. And we're hoping this will give us some insight into how something like the Expo line affects greenhouse gas emissions and can help to meet or can help to quantify its impact as far as SB 375 goes. So the study design itself is a treatment control design. We took the six westernmost stations on Expo. The treatment neighborhoods we designated as people that lived within a half mile of the 6 stations. And then we had control neighborhoods that were at distances from a half to more than 2 miles away. And the control neighborhoods are also used to study distance gradients. So we know that there's not a distinct cutoff, even though the literature shows that typically half a mile is where it starts to tail off for transit. Obviously, there's some gradient effect beyond that. So we've tried to capture that as well. We did the before opening data collection about a year ago. We started in September, and we went all the way through the winter and into February of last year. And we're out there in the field right now. As a matter of fact, some USC students here have been helping us with the data collection on the second part. So we've gone back about 6 months after Expo line opened to look at the new travel patterns that have developed. We tried to do it quickly because we didn't want to go long enough that there was movement into or out of the study area necessarily. We wanted to see how people who were there before the improvement traveled after it was in place. And we collected data about the same time of the year to make sure that there wasn't seasonal variation. So here's a map of the study area. The light blue circles are the control neighborhoods, and the dark blue are our comparison neighborhoods. We tried to be smart about this. This is USC over here. We tried to have our comparison neighborhoods align at least partly with the future Crenshaw line so that we could go back later on and possibly do some research in that area too. But we also chose some areas that are outside of the Crenshaw line area over here, and also one area that will be in a station area for phase 2 of Expo. So we were trying to build future research into this as well. The study itself consisted of what we called a baseline survey that was demographic information, attitudes, norms, and beliefs, which was my part of it. We also had a section on fear of crime and fear of crime on transit and in your neighborhood, and whether people had experienced crime themselves. We asked people to do a 7-day travel log of their activities. So we just gave them a little card that we asked them to count the number of trips they took by mode. And for walking and bicycling, we also asked them for any trip over 5 minutes to record their time that they spent doing those things. And the second piece with the travel log, we asked people to just record odometer readings for a week. So just start and end odometer readings every day during the week that they traveled. We also asked for the year, make, and model of the car so we could go back and back out greenhouse gas emissions from that. And then finally, for about half this sample, we had people wear a GPS and an accelerometer to measure both their locations during the 7-day study period and also how much physical activity they get. So some people were instrumented and they carried these with them from the time they got up in the morning until the time they went to bed at night. And that really did two things for us. First of all, we measured physical activity, but second, we wanted to verify the travel logs that we're getting in this form to make sure that we're getting something that's reasonable on the travel logs as well as comparing that to the GPS. So we're in the process of doing that now. In all, the study had consisted of 284 households, almost evenly split between control and experimental. And we had about half the sample, again, that was in the activity monitoring group with the GPS and accelerometers. And we offered people a couple different ways to do the study. They could do it totally on the internet, or they could have us send paper copies to them and they could fill them out and mail them back to us. And everything that we gave them as far as materials were in Spanish and English. So we tried to make this as flexible as possible for people to complete the study, to get as many people as possible into the study as we could. And just looking at the sample, there's no significant difference in before opening travel behavior between the experimental and control groups. So this is just some descriptive statistics. The important thing here, I guess, is really that we had about 26% of survey respondents, and this is the main respondent in the household, about 26% used transit during the 7-day period. We had a wide variety of ages from 18 to 86. We had a significant number of people who had no vehicles in their household. I guess everything else was pretty much in line with what the census data was. We didn't really have anything that stood out in the sample that was different from the census data. So my bit of this is the attitudinal part, and a model that I call the Perception-Intention-Adaptation model, or PIA model. And it's a framework that I've been working on to understand how these attitudinal, or what I call socio-psychological factors, affect travel behavior. And so my rationale for doing this is that one of the things for me, coming back to school, and I had worked as an engineer for a while, and I was a numbers guy because of doing that for so many years. But knowing my own travel and having commuted by bicycle for a number of years and lived in places that were rural and very urban, and having a long commute and a short commute, and having a high income and a low income, those things never really played a role in my decision to commute by bicycle. So when I came back to school and I started studying travel behavior, none of those attitudes, which were the reason why I rode the bike in the first place, really never entered into that. So there was this hole in the literature that I sort of jumped onto immediately. And when I studied at Cardiff University in Wales for a year, and as Marlon said, in Europe there's been more emphasis on this attitudinal approach to understanding travel behavior. And so I was exposed to it more there, but still not as much. I mean, it's still a very traditional sort of a program and traditional training for transportation planners. So it is going on more there, but I think it's still not as mainstream as we might think it is over there either. So those factors, social psychological factors, have been largely ignored in the travel behavior built environment literature, and leaving them out has left us little knowledge of how people interact with each other or how their mental processes affect travel behavior. And because of that, any interventions we make or investments we make could not be as effective as they might be otherwise if we don't address the fact that people's attitudes also affect travel behavior. And there have been a number of studies recently that have started to include attitudinal questions, but there hasn't really been much of a development of a framework as to why these attitudinal questions matter or how they relate to the built environment or how they relate to transportation infrastructure or whatever. And so what I've tried to do is to develop a complete framework that I can use to explore this. And the Expo line really provided a perfect laboratory to do that, because we were looking at a before and after change. We had, there was a number of different factors built in there that it was sort of a perfect opportunity to do this. And actually, I tell the story. When Marlon introduced the Expo line as a potential study, I remember it was probably a Friday afternoon research group meeting, and we were all a little bit, it was the end of the meeting, and Marlon said, the Expo line is opening up in LA, and one of you should do that for your dissertation research. And I remember the complete blank stares, I think, across the room when he said that. And, we all had our own interests, and transit was never an interest of mine. I think cycling was more of an interest that I had, and other PhD students had other interests. But after I think I slept on it for the weekend and started to think about it, and I was like, Marlon's right. I mean, this is a really unique opportunity, and it's been good and bad, I guess. My objectives in the Expo line were to develop and test this model that I come up with, and to use it to identify sort of what I call leverage points that could be used to facilitate travel behavior change or to maximize return on investments, as I talked about before. And the background on this, I really came up with this and going back through and backtracking through the literature from the mid-'70s about, it was sort of a time when the economic models of travel behavior and psychological models were sort of competing for the top spot. And one of those that really struck me was one that Friedhavens and Thal did in '77, that, because we're a school of social ecology, was really sort of a social ecological model. And it had a lot of information in it, or had a lot of weight on household composition and roles, people's lifestyles, their attitudes, what they perceive their travel behavior needs to be, where they need to go, what they need to do, financial and time constraints, and what they call the opportunity structure of the built environment, but essentially the land use mix and transportation and infrastructure. And then it had a feedback loop to take into account the way they adapt to travel behavior, or the way they adapt to changes in their both social environment and built environment. So adaptive travel behavior change based on person and environment fit. But what I added to that, and what sort of struck me when I started going back through the literature on travel behavior and psychological approaches, the theory of planned behavior has been used in several places for a number of different behaviors. It's become, especially health behaviors, has become widely used for things like smoking, quitting smoking, or obesity, or other health-related problems. And it has been used in a few travel behavior studies as well, although sort of in a limited way for the most part. Things sort of like on campus offering people a free bus pass for a certain amount of time or something like that. So it looked to me, when I looked at the Friedhavens and Thal model, the theory of planned behavior sort of fit in there, because at the time that they built that model, they didn't really have a good attitude behavior theoretical framework to use. And so this was sort of a logical way to develop this. And so just briefly, the theory of planned behavior posits that attitudes, subjective norms, so subjective norms are basically social pressures, and perceived control over behaviors really are what affect your behavior. So for my model, at the heart of this model is really the theory of planned behavior. So attitudes, social norms, perceived control, and then some things like personal norms, because in travel, I think concern about the environment is a sort of a personal norm that gets brought up a lot as far as people's behavior. And also habit, because travel is generally repeated and people develop habits, and financial and time constraints. And so all of these things sort of feed into this group of constructs. There's lifestyle desires, current travel patterns, the activities you have to do to meet the needs of other people in your household, the expectations of your friends and family, your perceptions of the built environment, how many jobs are available in the immediate area, recreation, shopping, those sorts of things, what you perceive is out there, your perception on how much you can afford to spend on travel or how much you can afford to spend on activities, and then residential location. So all of these things sort of feed into the attitudes, norms, and perceived control. And then outside of what's going on in people's heads, there's the actual built environment. So there's transportation opportunity structure, activity opportunity structure, and which really equates to the overall opportunity structure. So that's to me, your typical land use mix, transportation infrastructure, what actually exists on the ground. So perceptions of that and what's actually there may differ. And then finally, there's some way that people go back and they, based on what they need to do and what any changes in the environment, they have to have some way of adapting their behavior. So I guess to make this to sort of equate this to the Expo line, you can imagine somebody who lives over in Crenshaw, and before the Expo line, they drove their car, and they were concerned about the environment, but didn't want to ride the bus because it either wasn't convenient enough for them, and the bus stop that they went to was a little bit uncomfortable to be there, especially at night, possibly uncomfortable on a bus at night or at different times of the day. And so they drove their car. But when you have a change in the transportation opportunity structure like the Expo line, and people perceive that in a different way, then it changes attitudes, it changes possibly social norms, and possibly their idea of how much control they have over their behavior. And they do some adapting. So the person might say, oh, well, the Expo line might be, I don't want to ride the bus, but I'll take the Expo line. And so that might be how they adapt their travel behavior. And then that continues to go on. So if somebody decides they can ride to work on the train, they do that, and they decide, and they say, hey, the car just sits in the driveway these days. I don't use it anymore. I'm paying insurance on it. I'm paying taxes on it. I can just get rid of it and rely on our other car, share cars. So there's this adaptive process that goes on there, and you can see how that happens with people adding a person to their household or getting married or divorced or whatever happens. There are all these factors that affect all of these. So for the Expo line itself, I had two objectives. One was to just see if the socio-psychological questions that we asked people, which were based on previous research, whether they corresponded to the constructs that I had in the PIA model. And then, probably more importantly, do those constructs help to explain travel behavior? So the first thing we did was factor analysis of all the questions we asked. We wanted to take all the 37 questions that we asked people and condense them down into maybe 5 to 7 factors, because they should have been related, and we asked some similar questions about similar things. And we ended up with 5 interpretable factors with a Cronbach's alpha greater than 0.65, so they were reasonably reliable for an experimental measure. And this is just a huge list of all the questions that we asked, but the four factors we had came out to be transit safety and security. And I'll give you a few of the questions we asked people about things like that. We asked them, how safe do you feel while riding the train at night or during the day? We asked them things like, people who are important to me worry about my safety when I use public transit, and how much they agree or disagree with those things. And we had a full set of questions that equated with environmental norms. So these were sort of general environmental questions, like I don't like to waste natural resources or energy, or protecting the environment is important to me, or increasing use of public transportation is beneficial to the environment. So it wasn't about necessarily their behavior, but their overall sort of environmental attitudes and norms. And the third factor was transit attitudes. We asked them things specifically about transit, about schedule, and about cost. So questions like, the bus and the train take me where I need to go, or the bus and train schedules are convenient for me, or I could save money compared to driving a car. And we also asked a question, I don't know enough about public transit in my neighborhood to use it. So these were all questions that sort of lumped together. The fourth one was really about how people perceive their neighborhoods. So we asked them about whether they felt there were places to shop within their neighborhood, within walking distance, whether there were places they could go for recreation and entertainment, whether they get personal business like banking, laundry, and those sorts of things done. So that was all one factor. And the last one was a little bit not what I necessarily expected as far as the grouping. And I struggled a little bit with this to figure out what exactly it was saying, but two things really. We asked people about privacy on the train versus in their car. And so these were questions that had to do with privacy and crowding. but also things like it would be difficult to get everything done without a car, and my car is an important part of who I am. So there was this affect that they had for their vehicle, and also value that they put on privacy. So this was one factor also. So in the end, the factors did correspond with what we expected. The last one was a little bit different. I expected that to be broken out maybe into 2, but it ended up being 1. And it's similar to previous research that was done in the UK and Germany on transit and attitudes. So the second objective was to take these factors and put them in a logistic regression model of public transit use. So I had 3 models. One was socio-demographics only. The second one had socio-demographics, but we added land use and transit service variables to that. And the third one was a combined model that had all of those things and then added the socio-psychological in with it. So this is the result from the regression. And what's shown, the numbers that are shown are odds ratios. So with the odds ratios, a number greater than 1 means that if that variable increases with everything else held constant, people are more likely to ride transit. If it's less than 1, then they're less likely to ride transit. So for instance, age, as people age, they were less likely to use transit. If you had more household members that were over 18, at least for the first 2 models, you can imagine holding everything else constant, and then you add a person who needs to travel in your household. As expected, you would be more likely that somebody would have to ride transit if you added another person. Number of vehicles strongly affected the use of transit. So if more vehicle access resulted in less transit use. And employment status, not too surprising there, that if you were employed full-time, you were less likely to use transit. Also, education level, a little bit surprisingly, and I have a couple theories about why, especially 2-year college degrees, people were much less likely to use transit. One of them, I think, is possibly that people who have 2-year degrees also have jobs that require them to have a workplace that's not a fixed location. So that's part of it. It would be more difficult to use transit when your workplace doesn't have a fixed location. But also there may be some element of people who have a 2-year degree are sort of moving up the ladder. And so they may be aspiring to a different lifestyle. There may be a lifestyle issue there too that we need to maybe investigate a little more deeply. The second model, we added in all these transit and land use variables, and we tried to keep it somewhat compact, but we used WalkScore from walkscore.com, which takes an index basically of land use mix, street connectivity, those sorts of things, and rolls it into one score. We used annual average daily traffic within a half mile, so how close people live to major arterial roads or freeways. Total employment within a half mile of their home, the number of transit lines that pass within a half mile, and we developed a headway index, which Sandeep worked for us on that and did, helped us to develop some more robust measures of transit level of service. So we had a headway index, and we had total employment accessible from transit within a half mile. So the transit lines that pass within a half mile of somebody's house, how much employment could they access from those? None of those things were significant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there are some things that are characteristic of this area that I think affected that. In the third model, we added in the factors that I developed through the attitudinal questions, and all but one of those was significant at least the 0.05 level. That should be 0.05, not 0.5 here. But so people's perceptions of safety, their attitudes towards transit, the perceived neighborhood opportunities, so what's within walking distance of their home, and also car attachment were all significant in this, and they all had the signs we expected. That people who had positive transit attitudes tended to ride transit more. People who were conscious of safety, if they were concerned about safety on transit, they rode transit less. If people had opportunities within a walking distance of their home, they probably didn't use their car as much, and they could free themselves up to use transit. So all those things were as we expected them to be. So basically, the addition of these things improved the model and added to our understanding of the decision-making process. And it points to leverage points that could be used, such as transit safety perceptions, trying to dispel some rumors or some feelings people have about transit safety, generally improving attitudes towards transit service and convenience, which something like the Expo line may do just because of the fact that it's sort of a quantum leap in transit, and perceived amenities or services within walking distance of their home. So again, land use mix, but we're not talking about actual land use mix, but perceived land use mix and amenities. So as I said, the one thing about this is that this is a study of neighborhood level effects. And the study area that we had was reasonably small compared to even a city. It was really a collection of neighborhoods. Certainly it was not equivalent to what you would see in a regional study. So we had a lot less variation in land use, in transportation infrastructure, and transit service. It was generally a well-served transit area, good transportation infrastructure, close to the freeways. The land use is fairly uniform. The street patterns are fairly uniform. So it shows the importance of using appropriate methods for the level of analysis. The land use and transit access variables were not significant in this, but that doesn't mean they might not be significant at a different level of analysis. Certainly on a regional study or even maybe a citywide study, it would probably have a different effect. Which brings me all the way back to the start of this talk, which is that the top-down approaches that the MPOs have to use, that uses a complex travel model to model these things, are really limited in their ability to account for local programs and any innovative efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. So meeting the goals of SB 375 will require both regional planning and local innovation. And evaluation is, of course, vital to this, and that's what we're all about in the Expo line study.
Okay. The first point that I have is that we're kind of entering, and this is kind of oriented to the students, by the way. We are entering kind of a new era in research in many fields, I think. And that new era is looking at much more micro questions. We are more and more interested in very small units. We're interested in individuals, we're interested in neighborhoods, we're interested in specific establishments or employers and so on. So we've done a lot of kind of aggregate research in a lot of different fields, and now it seems that we are paying more and more attention to much more micro level kind of interest. We, in the transportation field, we've known for a long time that we don't have a good understanding of travel behavior. We know that individuals display a huge amount of variation, and we're really not good at explaining it. We have a sense that the local environment really does play a role, but don't really know much on the issue of local land use. Those of you who have at least taken my class, and probably those of you who are in Professor Bornett's class now, know that the evidence in terms of local land use is really mixed. You know, I always talk to my students about there have been 150 studies and you still don't know the answer. Are you sure you want to do one more? So we have a lot of uncertainty. So one of the interesting things to me is that I think that our research is being facilitated by the availability of methods and technologies that we never had before. And so I hope you noticed in this presentation that this wasn't just any old data collection. This just wasn't any old, let's go survey people. It was, let's survey people, let's outfit them with GPS, let's give them accelerometers, let's track each and everything they do. And then not only can we develop checks on our data to make sure that what they're telling us in the surveys is consistent, but it gives us an amazingly rich data source in terms of what people really did. The same is true of our analytical tools once we have the data, because we now have tools to look at very fine levels of spatial aggregation. We can do a much better job of understanding what's happening in the local environment. So this is really neat to me, neat research, because it's kind of at the leading edge of where I think the field is going. I wanted to make a point of something that was almost passed over in your presentation, but again, this is a student-oriented point, And that is the strategy of the research. Isn't it clever that Professor Bornett said, not only am I doing the Expo line, but I want to line myself up for the next 10 projects. And so I'm going to discover, I'm going to identify my control areas very carefully so that when the Crenshaw line gets built 10 years from now, 15, Professor Bornett will still be doing this research, right? And his students, more importantly.
2018.
2018, right. And so again, that was really, for those of you who are kind of starting your research career, that's a really smart thing to do. The kind of the last area that I want to say something about is, in fact, the research here on the role of attitudes. Any of you who have actually done research and modeled individual travel behavior would discover that our ability to explain that is really dismal. You can run regressions and get an R-square of 0.1, right? Just really dismal. And lots of things are significant, but the vast majority of what people are doing, we just simply are not explaining. And so the fact that we're now getting serious about other aspects of individuals, right, including attitudes, is again a really good thing. We have a lot of sort of suggestive evidence that attitudes matter. First of all, we have information from other fields of study that individual attitudes matter. The public health people are really engaged in attitudes and how we might actually influence the development of attitudes over time, how we might influence how to change attitudes over time. So lots of other areas of research are already very much aware that attitudes matter. Once we get a better handle on how attitudes matter, then as was presented here, we have a lot of options, not only from kind of a public policy perspective in terms of how should we spend our money, but we also have a lot of options in terms of just like the cereal producers and General Motors, how do we communicate the product, okay? And so what came to my mind was not just, sort of our planning decisions, but also questions like, if people do have more exposure to transit, does that actually generate different attitudes than people don't? And in this kind of research, you could actually do that. There's an area of psychology that talks about cognitive dissonance. So we would presume that whatever people are doing are somewhat consistent with their attitudes, right, and their perceptions. So are we observing over time people kind of adapting to the changes in their environment, for their attitudes change? So as sort of, there's a lot of opportunity for longitudinal kinds of research. There's also, if you really think in this way, then you could think of a whole bunch of strategies in terms of how you would go about promoting transit. So it does make sense to hand out, for example, free tickets for the first month, right? If these attitudes really matter. Well, we've done stuff like that without knowing for sure. So this research should be really helpful in sort of helping us to learn how we would better promote transit use, promote the resources that are actually out there, and so on. And that's as good for pedestrian mobility, for walking, for biking, for whatever you want to talk about. All of these things would apply. So I really think there's an awful lot here. Because I didn't read the paper, and because you didn't say it here, I had some questions about, for example, the factor analysis, and there are all these attitudes in transit. I don't know if you asked those of everybody. So are we getting, the transit users versus the non-transit users? I don't know. It's always attitudes are really important, but they're difficult to measure. And so we could argue all day long over, were these the right questions or were they not the right questions? I don't really want to go there, but I would think that somewhere there would be a discussion of sort of how you came about, how you came to the specific questions that you asked and how you justified them. I have one quibble that is, we always do this to our students, so I'm going to do it to you, which is slides that people cannot read are really frustrating. So, figure out how to convey your information, which is really interesting and really good, in a slide that people can look at. All right, so that's all I have. And I think we should give you a chance to respond, and then we'll have questions. Is that okay? You were out of the room.
Yeah, and that's certainly if you don't have a response, you don't have to have
Yeah,
one.
you don't have
open
to.
it up.
Maybe a little bit about, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of developing this set of questions and the trade-offs we had to make, because, you know, measuring attitudes, it really comes down to measuring attitudes about a specific behavior. And so when we surveyed people, we didn't ask only transit users, we asked everybody. We didn't want to tip anybody off either on what was going on with the study. So we didn't want to say, what are your opinions about light rail? What are your opinions about the Expo line in particular? We didn't even mention the Expo line when we did this. So it was difficult to develop a set of questions that captured the attitudes that might be important for the Expo line without tipping people off to what we were doing. And so, you know, we had a much larger set that we ended up cutting down to just for the sake of making the survey a little bit more manageable for the respondent. And the difficulty also for Expo was we were interested in physical activity, we were interested in vehicle miles traveled. There's no way that we could have captured all that, and I think in the attitudinal questions without making it just a huge survey. So that's the difficulty, I think, in doing this. You have to be very specific about the behavior that you're interested in. And we asked, the vast majority of the questions we asked were about transit in particular, but not about light rail or whatever. So there's some difficulties there with doing this. And I think that's part of the difficulty with going back now and using the attitudinal questions, which I would really like to do with VMT, that we didn't ask enough questions about car behavior. We have a lot of questions about transit behavior. And so I'm not sure we're going to be able to do what we necessarily investigate that with the questions that we had for this study. So there's just this issue of being specific on the questions.
I think that Professor Giuliano's remark might be characterized as a plea for marketing research, all right, which is what
Exactly.
they do.
Yeah.
You know. And let me give you an analogy that may be helpful. Lou Gerstner used to be head of Nabisco, if I'm not correct, and then IBM hired him when they were in trouble. And what he did was get rid of the iron business, which was the machinery, and get into services. And that's how IBM grew. When I listen to the talks and the fact you can't explain anything, I say, here's a bunch of people who are city planners, or geographers, or economists, and they just can't help talking about space and all this land use and so forth. Maybe those are not the right categories at all. Maybe you need to think of it as a consumer good. I don't know how to ask that question, but because we're all in the space and VMT and whatnot business, and I'm not complaining that maybe it is not the right variable to explain.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because now I'm going to hit Marlon about this, because there's something I've been really interested in from the very beginning, and it's from a study that was done in the UK that really tried to segment people based on market segmentation techniques. So they tried to group people based on their attitudes, but also their behavior into market segments, just like General Motors or whoever else does. Right. And so we as planners have completely ignored that. And so we don't target people with certain information. We don't, we have this general, we want, these land use changes that are beneficial for sustainability, but we don't target people in a way that makes them want to change their behavior, or in ways that they feel are important. So I think that's a key thing to take away once we get a handle on what attitudes are important. But the other thing about it is I think that we should be doing a lot more qualitative research in transportation. I think that if I had to do this over again, I would have gone and had focus groups with the people in this area before we developed these attitudinal questions. We would have, from that, sort of been able to draw out what was important to the population that we were studying and develop attitudinal questions. We didn't have the luxury of doing that. We had a few months before the Expo line was supposed to open. But I think that those things are the key to
Let me encourage you then to do the qualitative research, even if you don't have the before and after, because you'll have subsequent periods. Mm-hmm. And almost like recruit someone from your business school
Yeah.
or someone like that who does this for a living or knows how to do it. So that because you'll get new variables. And I don't really know anything about this. There may be the bicyclists. I choose the Expo line every day.
Right.
And you can't get through the aisles because the bicyclists, take that, right? And, it's some other things. But I don't know what the answer is. But I do know that given the failures to predict behavior, it's worth looking someplace else. But I don't have an answer for you all.
Yeah, we did a few neighborhood council meetings, or I did one at least, where I talked to people about it, and there were issues that came up that I would have never thought would have come up. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to do to really get this, really make the attitudinal questions match the problem that we're after.
Mr. Spears, I have a question regarding the use of GPS to collect the data. It actually reminds me of what commercial broadcast stations do. They use the personal people meter to collect that information to make sure that the stations and the day parts that people are listening to particular stations are accurate and true. Did you find that using GPS was more accurate than, saying, handing out the paper?
Well, we're still sort of wading through the GPS data because we have an awful lot of data. I don't know what the answer is. Doug Houston would be the person to answer that, and unfortunately he's not here today. But we also, in addition to the GPS, we had talked and we have piloted smartphone apps, for instance, to do this sort of thing. So where you've got GPS combined with people reporting. And we've done some pilots on that, and I don't know that it's worked out particularly well so far, but you might know a little better than I do, Marlon.
In terms of the GPS, the original motivation was just what you said. These things evolve quite a lot over time. So our early thinking about all of this was much more one-dimensional, and we viewed the GPS data in particular as just a way to validate the self-report, and frankly, at the last minute, added on the accelerometer. It was literally a last-minute kind of, will we, won't, and thank goodness we did. So we are going through the data. In fact, Doug Houston isn't here because I suspect he's going through the data today, probably, for his paper that he needs to present at a conference next week. The very short story of what we think we're finding, and it's very preliminary and based on recollections, I kind of tend to look for, if you treat GPS as ground truth, or as our self-report, how big is the error and is it biased? So far, I'm beginning to think we may not have bias, but we have pretty big error ranges. But we need to plow through it some more to really push that, because however those two questions fall will really determine, among other things, the statistical methods we need to use going forward, in addition to survey procedures. So the short answer is kind of, we're still learning what it is that would tell us.
You mentioned the error ratio. Before the advent of the PPM, the personal people meter, radio stations used to use diaries. And they would send them out to whatever households to get a record of the times, the days, and the stations that people were listening to. Not the most accurate way, but that's what they had at the time.
Yeah, this is very much analogous, I think. We're kind of in that world, so to speak.
I think I may have missed it, but did you have any appreciable attrition rate of survey responders?
Well, we had a very poor response rate. That's one thing I didn't mention at the beginning, which was a lot of, I think there are a lot of things we could have done to get it better. Part of it was we were only able to offer limited compensation to people for doing this, and it was a 7-day study. It required quite a bit of effort on their part. But attrition, interestingly, since we've gone back on the second round this time, the attrition so far has been very low. Partly because we're able to offer people more money to do it. The compensation is more than doubled. But, the feedback I've had from people who did this study, for the most part, has been really positive. Some people say, actually say, it was fun, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. So I've only had one person. I'm the person who's responsible for calling the people who did the activity monitoring. And I've only had one person say no. I've had people move out of the area, or people who haven't responded to me yet, but I've only had one person so far who just said, no, I'm not doing it again this year. So it's been better than we expected.
Yep. But those are the two key points, because there are a lot of students here. The response rate is just, fall off your chair, scary. I mean, I'll say the number because we got to be truthful about it. We were down around 1%. And that's, I told you, fall off your chair is scary. You almost fell off your chair, right? And actually that is not uncommon in a lot of survey work. One of the things about this, we think we have we've got an experimental control group design. So there's a lot of things that are going on that we have some hope can be fixed by that, such as people select into this study. We know it by intuition. We can look at particular characteristics and know we are not getting a random draw from the population, nor would you. But there's no evidence that any of that non-randomness is any different statistically across experimental or control. We actually did quite well on demographics and income distribution, matching the population.
Surprisingly, yeah. I think it's surprisingly well considering.
So yeah, initial response in was very difficult. Our compensation was by any measure maybe half of what typical studies of this sort would offer or less. We were able to come up and kind of meet that norm and compensate at about $75 second time, and for whatever reason, so far attrition has not been a problem. And there have been a couple of studies like this, and the main source of attrition appears to be in other studies people moving out of the study area. And so that's kind of a killer if you're studying a location-specific project. And that is kind of the lesson. And we always had a little bit of hope that possibly the slow real estate market would help us. And frankly, we don't know, though. It is an area with a lot of renters, and so you just don't know until you get into it. Yeah, that was the thing. So we just didn't know. But so far, we are well into the wave 2, and so far, I think what we're seeing suggests a lower attrition rate than we had braced for, which, thank goodness.
So sort of related to that, given that there was kind of a preponderance of female respondents, are you sort of in any ways concerned, or did you think about using sampling weights, and then especially regarding sort of the safety factor, how that might vary substantially by gender?
I mean, we could do that. We haven't really thought about it, I don't think.
Yeah, we haven't thought about that. We could try it, but really with the sample size this small, I'm not even sure what we could get out of expansion weights. Yeah.
One other thing we did that ended up being smart was when we bought the list of addresses, we also bought, it was marketing data, so it had some income information, some other information about the households. So we had a way of looking at non-respondents and how they compared to our respondents, at least in some way, to see whether there was a bias there. But
yeah, which we also haven't really explored deeply.
Yeah.
I mean, so we do. One of the plans, we are sitting on kind of an immense amount of data that we're just kind of working through, so to speak.
I'm just wondering, is there any, in your analysis, is there any sign that the attitude toward changes between the two groups, the control and the parent group, is there any difference between that? Because I'm wondering whether, because a lot of renters there, they will move to the place surrounding the station because they want to take the transit window.
right. So you mean as far as as far as change in, we're actually doing a new mover survey. So we're surveying people who've moved in with a slightly different protocol. People have moved in since the first survey. You mean as far as people within the study area relocating to be close to transit? I don't know. You know, we don't have the data back, and we don't have as many movers as you might think because we're coming back fairly soon after the first round. But since I haven't seen the data yet, I don't know how many people have possibly moved within the study area. One thing we did when we bought the new mover address lists, if there was a way for us to match names with people from the first list, which we bought addresses for every household in the study area, then maybe we could look at if there are people who've moved within the study area, if people have moved closer to Expo or not, but we haven't explored that yet.
I'm doing the similar stuff. I have two questions. Well, for me, the neighborhood safety is kind of a perception variable, which is related to perceived environment.
Right.
Do you think it's since you call it attitude variable, so do you see those attitudinal difference is really difference by socio-demographic difference, or is it difference by the place where they live? And then my second question would be, have you found any magnitude in terms of how much they affect attitudinal variable, how much they affect their transit use compared to land use effect? Have you found any?
Attitude compared to what effect?
Land use effect.
Land use. Well,
yeah, in terms of magnitude, does it have bigger impact or?
It was significantly. I mean, it was a lot bigger. The land use impacts, at least the measures we had, were not even close to being significant. But again, our study area is kind of. I wouldn't actually expect there to be land use impacts, to be honest, because the neighborhoods over there are fairly uniform in terms of land use. There are people who obviously live closer to commercial corridors like Crenshaw and those sorts of things who have a different land use mix within a half mile of their homes. But I think, I don't know, we have to do some more detailed analysis, I think, to really sort out what's going on there. And also the same thing with with safety. Perceptions of safety. There's actually another PhD student who's working specifically with the safety questions. She may be able to answer that question better than I can, because she's really digging into those things within the Expo line data. And I can give you her name. She might really have some insights on that. Marlon, have you talked to Xinping lately about that?
Not specifically about that.
Okay.
But that is a thought that I think part of what you hadn't used, she had what we called kind of the victimization and
Right.
harassment data also.
There's a richer set of variables we had in there. We asked people if they had ever been experienced harassment, or if they had been assaulted, or
Yeah.
so there was a lot of information in there that I didn't use in my paper.
And she's boring into that, and that may
Right.
provide some ability to try to kind of separate kind of an attitudinal factor from something that would be kind of experiential.
And that's part of the reason why I haven't, because that's her part of it. So.
Last question.
Okay. So kind of going back to Dr. Krieger's point about business and social marketing. I mean, the next big thing in transportation is social marketing, social media. Everyone knows about it. And I think your research kind of puts something into this direction in terms of how we can change people's attitudes and so that we can change their behavior. So, are you aware of any like social marketing or marketing strategies in general put together by Metro or a community organization to promote more use of transit after or before the opening of the Expo line? And that's what I'm wondering right now.
I know there was a lot of effort put in. Maybe somebody here knows more about Expo than I do as far as what they did in advance. But I think part of the marketing of Expo was that it was delayed so long that everyone, had this expectation about it, and there was this, people were excited about it opening. Now, I know going over to the neighborhoods there, they did have quite a bit of advertising. As far as social media, I don't know what Metro did in advance of Expo line opening. I don't know what their plans are in the future. But I agree. Social media is a big deal, and I think that one other aspect of travel behavior that we haven't really touched on is sort of social network analysis and its relationship to travel behavior. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be done there to sort of understand travel behavior from a completely different perspective. So.